You've done the spreadsheet. Multiply your annual spending by 25. That's your number. Hit it, retire, withdraw 4% a year, and the math says you're set for life. You've seen it in 100 articles, 1,000 YouTube comments, on every retirement calculator you've ever opened. It feels solved, settled. A clean rule that turns an impossibly complicated question into one multiplication problem. Here's what almost none of those articles tell you. The 4% rule wasn't built for you. It was built for one specific 30-year window of American market history, tested against a narrow set of assumptions that may not apply to your retirement at all. And it has a failure mode that's almost never mentioned in the version of the rule that gets repeated everywhere. The rule isn't wrong exactly. It's incomplete in ways that can cost a retiree everything if they treat it as a guarantee instead of what it actually is. A historical observation with a specific blind spot called sequence risk. This isn't a video telling you the 4% rule is useless. It's one of the most genuinely useful starting points in personal finance history. This is a video about the difference between a rule of thumb and a guarantee, and the three places that gap becomes dangerously expensive for someone who retires at exactly the wrong moment in market history. And I'll warn you now, the sequence risk section is going to change how you think about the first 5 years of retirement specifically, because that window matters more than almost anything else in the entire plan. My name is Gaurav, and I spend a genuinely unreasonable amount of time pulling apart the financial rules that feel settled, but are actually built on assumptions nobody examines. If you've ever calculated your retirement number using the 4% rule and felt done thinking about it, subscribe and hit that like button because today we're opening up exactly what's underneath that number. Quick thing first. Not a financial advisor, not financial advice. Just the research behind the rule everyone quotes and almost nobody actually reads. Let me introduce you to two people, Marcus and Elena. Both retired at 62 with exactly $1.25 million in savings. Both plan to withdraw 4%, or $50,000 a year. Both followed the rule precisely as advertised. Marcus retired in 1995. Elena retired in 2000. Same rule, same withdrawal rate, same starting balance in real terms. One of them is still comfortably funded decades later. One of them ran into serious trouble before their 10th year of retirement. Hold on to them. We'll come back. Here's the framing that makes this entire system click. The 4% rule comes from research by a financial planner named William Bengen in 1994, later expanded by what's known as the Trinity Study in 1998. Bengen looked at historical market data going back to 1926 and asked a specific question. What withdrawal rate, adjusted for inflation each year, would have allowed a portfolio to survive every rolling 30-year period in American market history without running out of money? The answer that survived the worst historical 30-year stretch was approximately 4.5%, rounded down conservatively to 4% for safety margin. That's a genuinely useful piece of research. But notice what it actually tested. It tested a specific 70-year window of U.S. market history. It assumed a specific portfolio mix, roughly 50% to 75% stocks and the remainder bonds. It assumed a fixed 30-year retirement horizon. And critically, it answered the question, would this have worked in the past, rather than will this work in your specific future? Which are not the same question no matter how often they get treated as interchangeable in retirement calculators and YouTube comment sections. Layer 1. The historical sample size problem. Here's something almost never mentioned when the 4% rule comes up. Bengen's original study and the Trinity study that followed it are testing rolling 30-year periods drawn from roughly 70 years of data. That sounds like a lot until you realize the rolling periods overlap heavily with each other. A retirement starting in 1970 and one starting in 1972 share 28 of their 30 years in common. You don't actually have 40 or 50 independent test cases. You have a small handful of genuinely distinct economic eras: the Great Depression recovery, the post-war boom, the 1970s stagflation, the 1980s and 90s bull run, repeated and overlapped to produce the appearance of dozens of data points. A 2021 paper from Morningstar's retirement research team explicitly revisited the 4% rule using updated capital market assumptions for the coming decades, accounting for current bond yields and equity valuations rather than the full historical average. Their conclusion was that a withdrawal rate closer to 3.3% might be more appropriate for someone retiring today. Given that government bond yields and stock valuations don't currently mirror the conditions present during most of the historical periods, the original 4% figure was tested against. That's not a small adjustment. The difference between a 4% and a 3.3% withdrawal rate on the same $1.25 million portfolio is the difference between $50,000 a year and $41,250 a year, a gap of nearly $9,000 annually that compounds in importance every single year of a multi-decade retirement. Layer 2, sequence of returns risk, and this is the layer that actually determines whether a retirement succeeds or fails, more than almost any other single variable. Here's the mechanism. The 4% rule assumes you'll experience something close to the average historical return over your retirement. But averages hide enormous variation in when the good and bad years actually happen, and it turns out the order matters enormously, not just the average. Marcus retired in 1995, right before one of the strongest sustained bull markets in modern history. His portfolio grew substantially in the first several years of retirement, even while he was withdrawing from it, because his withdrawals were a small percentage compared to the market gains happening simultaneously. By the time any downturn eventually arrived, his portfolio had grown so large that the same percentage withdrawal represented a much smaller actual burden relative to his balance. Elena retired in 2000, directly into the dot-com crash, followed within a decade by the 2008 financial crisis. She was withdrawing 4% of her starting balance every year, adjusted for inflation, while her portfolio was simultaneously losing value in the market downturn. This combination, withdrawing money while the underlying balance shrinks, is mathematically far more damaging than experiencing the exact same average return in a different order. Researchers call this sequence of returns risk, and it's the primary reason two retirees with identical average returns across their retirement can have wildly different outcomes depending purely on when the bad years happen to fall. A study from Wade Pfau, a retirement researcher who has published extensively on this exact problem, modeled retirees starting withdrawals in different historical years, and found that someone retiring directly before or during a significant market downturn faced dramatically higher probabilities of portfolio depletion than someone retiring just a few years earlier or later, even though both groups experienced the same long-run average market return over their full retirement horizon. The first 5 to 10 years of withdrawals matter disproportionately more than any other period in retirement, because that's when a downturn does the most permanent damage to the remaining balance available to recover. Run the actual numbers on Elena. Starting with $1.25 million, withdrawing $50,000 in year one, her portfolio experiences roughly a 9% decline in year one of the dot-com crash, then continued weakness for 2 more years. By year 3, even with her withdrawals staying roughly flat in real terms, her portfolio balance has fallen to approximately $950,000, meaning her $50,000 plus withdrawal, now adjusted upward for inflation to around $53,000, represents not 4% of her current balance, but closer to 5.6%. She's now withdrawing at a rate well above what any historical model considers safe, precisely because the sequence of returns front-loaded losses into her most vulnerable early years. Layer 3. The fixed spending assumption, which almost never matches how actual retirees behave or actually need to behave to protect their portfolio. The original 4% rule assumes withdrawals increase with inflation every single year regardless of market conditions, a rigid spending pattern that doesn't reflect how most thoughtful retirees actually manage money. And that rigidity is specifically what creates the catastrophic outcomes in bad sequence years. If you mechanically withdraw your inflation-adjusted amount during a market crash purely because the rule says to, you lock in selling depreciated assets at exactly the worst possible moment. Research from Jonathan Guyton and William Klinger, published in the Journal of Financial Planning, examined what happens when retirees use flexible guardrail strategies instead, adjusting withdrawals modestly downward during market downturns and allowing them to rise during strong years, rather than mechanically following a fixed inflation-adjusted schedule regardless of market conditions. Their research found that retirees willing to reduce withdrawals by just 10% during clearly defined bad years could sustain meaningfully higher baseline withdrawal rates, in some models approaching 5% to 5.5%, specifically because the flexibility prevented the portfolio from being forced to sell heavily depreciated assets during the exact year's sequence risk does the most damage. This is the layer that gets stripped out almost entirely when the 4% rule gets repeated as a single static number. The original Benjamin research and the Trinity study were testing a worst-case static withdrawal pattern specifically to find a conservative floor. They were never claiming that rigid, unconditional 4% withdrawals regardless of circumstances was the optimal strategy. That nuance simply doesn't survive being compressed into a single repeatable number across 1,000 YouTube comments. Now here's the research that reframes all of this in the most useful practical way. A comprehensive review published by the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College examined multiple dynamic withdrawal strategies against the static 4% benchmark and found that retirees using even simple dynamic adjustments, withdrawing somewhat less following years where the portfolio declined, and somewhat more following years where it grew substantially, achieved meaningfully lower probabilities of running out of money, while often supporting higher average lifetime spending than the rigid static approach. The static 4% rule isn't dangerous because the number is wrong. It's dangerous specifically when treated as a fixed, unconditional commitment rather than a flexible starting point that should respond to what's actually happening in the market during the most vulnerable early years. So here's the practical framework. 3 moves that directly counter the 3 layers we just walked through. Move 1 addresses the historical sample size problem. Treat 4% as a reasonable conservative starting estimate, not a precise guarantee, and build in a buffer by targeting your number using a slightly more conservative figure, somewhere between 3.3% and 3.8%. If you're retiring during a period of historically elevated stock valuations or unusually low bond yields, which current research suggests describes much of the present environment, Move 2 addresses sequence of returns risk directly. Build a cash and short-term bond buffer covering 2 to 3 years of expenses, specifically for the first 5 years of retirement, allowing you to draw from that buffer instead of selling depreciated stocks during an early downturn, preserving the equity portion of your portfolio to recover once markets stabilize rather than locking in losses at the worst possible moment. Move 3 addresses the fixed spending assumption. Adopt a dynamic guardrail approach rather than a rigid inflation-adjusted schedule. Specifically, commit in advance to reducing withdrawals by 10% in any year following a portfolio decline greater than 15%, and allow withdrawals to rise modestly in years following strong portfolio growth. Giving yourself the flexibility that the original research actually showed produces meaningfully better long-term outcomes than a fixed number followed mechanically regardless of circumstances. Marcus, who retired into a favorable sequence, never needed to deviate from the rigid 4% schedule, and the rule worked beautifully for him precisely because his specific historical timing happened to align with the conditions the rule was originally tested against. Elena, after running into trouble in her 3rd year, implemented the guardrail approach retroactively, reducing her withdrawal to roughly $45,000 for 2 years following the downturn rather than mechanically increasing it for inflation. And her portfolio recovered alongside the broader market recovery that followed, ultimately sustaining her through a full retirement that the rigid version of the rule would have put at serious risk of failure. Here's the truth I'd want a friend to tell me directly. The 4% rule is not a law of physics. It's a historical observation about what would have worked across specific past market conditions, built on a sample size smaller than it appears, vulnerable to a sequence risk problem that disproportionately punishes retirees unlucky enough to retire right before a downturn, and originally tested with far more nuance and flexibility than the single repeated number suggests. The retirees who actually thrive aren't the ones who found the perfect static number. They're the ones who understood the rule as a starting point for a flexible plan that responds to what the market actually does during the years it matters most. Multiply your spending by 25 if you want a starting estimate. Just don't mistake a starting estimate for a guarantee, because the gap between those two things is exactly where Elena nearly ran out of money and exactly where a little flexibility saved her. If this changed how you think about your own retirement number, drop a comment telling me whether you've ever stress-tested your plan against a bad first 5 years scenario. I actually read them, And if you want the full picture on how two people with the same job can retire decades apart, that video is on the screen right now. Go watch that one next. I'll see you in it.